right. Welcome to Living in the Past, where two middle-aged dudes relive their past by enjoying the pop culture of their youth. Hey, it is October, and what better time to dive into the horror genre than this month? On this episode, we're doing a double feature, Friday the 13th, part 1 and 2. I know you've been waiting for this. I know you can't wait. I know you watch it every Halloween. And we're going to just wade our way through it, but I'm not alone. And Devin isn't here. On this episode, we have Jeff here to help us navigate the incredibly complex world of Friday the 13th. Jeff, welcome. It's so good to have you on the show.
Yeah, this is exciting. Thank you so much for having me.
So Friday the 13th, there's so much to talk about. I mean, there's the films themselves, there's the goofiness of them, but there's also a much bigger kind of almost sociological conversation that needs to go on when you talk about Friday the 13th. 2 years ago, we did an episode on Friday the 13th, part 4. So it's been a while since the show Living in the Past has revisited this. But I think we need to talk because we're middle-aged dudes. We were kids when the movies came out. When did you first see Friday the 13th? Any Friday the 13th? When did you first see it?
Well, this is kind of an interesting thing because you're talking to someone who for the first 16 years of his life was in a household that did not have a screen.
Oh, yeah.
My parents, the way that they lived their lives was it was all rich literature all the time. Yeah. So I was the kid who would go to the public library. The librarians had been told, do not let him get into the Stephen King section.
Yes.
And I would sneak over there, steal one, and then go sit in the young adult section with a big cardboard book hiding The Shining. So I loved this genre before I even got to see it on film.
Right.
And it's weird. Friday the 13th was actually my second horror film. My first one was The Omen.
Okay. Whoa. So, that was your first? The Omen was your first horror film?
And it was staying the night at my best friend's house. His parents were the ones with the satellite dish. And
there you go.
But it was Betamax, I think.
Oh, wow.
So, but we had another sleepover, and this ended up becoming a tradition. But, I can remember 11 o'clock at night. It wasn't October. It was during the summer. And staying up, popcorn, the whole 9 yards. But just having it unfold in front of you as a kid was just, you don't have any of those presuppositions.
You don't?
You're just like, what? And of course, super fundy, family. And all of a sudden I'm seeing people with their heads getting chopped off and axes in the face.
Scandalous.
Oh, it was so great. It was like that forbidden fruit. It's kind of how it was during that era. I was probably 11 or 12.
Yeah.
Probably in that age range. And, super fun. I remember we watched it, and then the next morning on HBO, which was also Forbidden Fruit, we get up in the morning, and Saturday the 14th is playing.
Oh, that's
so we
great.
watch Friday the 13th at night and Saturday the 14th.
Yeah.
That's
so great.
It's one of those things where I think that it really drew me in and made it so that I really fell in love with the horror genre.
Yeah, it's interesting. Friday the 13th Part 2 was the first rated R movie I ever saw. My parents had we lived in Hawaii at the time, and we had a lanai, kind of like a screened-in porch. And we had a TV out there hooked up to cable.
Oh, that's awesome.
And so our Atari was out there, and so I would hang out there. I was mostly outside, but there was one afternoon, I was just home flipping cable channels, and we had I think it was I'm not sure exactly, but my hunch is that they were doing an HBO preview weekend or something.
Those were the best.
And I'm like, what is this? And I started watching. It was probably summer because it was not dark, but it was at night. It was 7 or 8 or something like. And I watched Friday the 13th Part 2, and I was scandalized. I was probably 2nd, 3rd grade is my guess. So I was little.
Crazy.
I was little, and it was a lot of things. First, felt like, of course, I'd seen Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark, but it felt like I was watching real murder, to my little brain, know. And first boobies I saw, it was all these firsts, and I was blown away.
The thing that was, now that you said that, the thing that I think really set it off for me was we would constantly, it was the Gen X, and we were small town. It was Oregon for me, but we were allowed to be out after night playing The Devil's Out Tonight and all those night games.
Yeah.
But it became a trope with us where
Right.
you'd be playing and all of a sudden you'd hear somebody making the noise and you're like, oh no.
Yeah.
Such a cool thing.
Yeah, it was saturating culture when we were kids. I mean, it was something I remember even hanging out with friends and just them describing a movie they had seen, whether it was part 3 or part 4, like, and then this happened and everyone's gathered around listening.
Yep.
We didn't have the internet. It was all word of mouth and we talked about it, narrated the story to one another, and then we did everything we could to see the movie. The movie Halloween by John Carpenter was a really, really big deal, and it sort of set some things in motion. And I think by the time you roll around to like 79, 80, of course, Halloween, I think is 78. There's this sort of clamoring amongst Hollywood developers of film to create, to cash in on this craze that was surrounding Halloween. Of course, we have Texas Chainsaw Massacre, earlier in the 70s, but Halloween does something to kind of the cultural zeitgeist. It just lands right in the middle of it. Everyone's sort of like gravitating toward these types of projects. And then you have this guy, Sean Cunningham, who he's like, I'm going to cash in on it. And what's interesting about he's an independent filmmaker, basically.
Right.
He's like, I'm going to come up with this idea and I'm going to sell it. And he takes it to Hollywood and he sold it for a lot of money.
Yeah.
And they start developing it. I think the budget was somewhere around like somewhere between 500 to 600,000, somewhere around there, 650,000, I think. And they make this film in New Jersey. It's a slasher film trying to cash in on Halloween. And it's kind of fascinating how it all comes about. And it does incredible, incredible business. Even to this day, I'm sort of shocked that it was because when you watch Friday the 13th Part 1, it is filmmaking wise, it's kind of like, okay. But you had a few people working on it that did some pretty extraordinary things. You have an incredible makeup effects artist working on the film. You have, which really lends itself to, that's what kids want to see, is the gross kills. You have some charismatic actors. Kevin Bacon is in this cast. And I was watching a documentary, and so many of the actresses said they knew he would be a star.
Really?
And one of the comments made was like, he just was different in terms of his professionalism on a goofy movie that we were working on. He took it seriously. And they kind of knew then that he was he was destined for something special down the road. But yeah, I mean, it is what it is. There's a simplicity to Friday the 13th. I love the New Jersey setting. Like, what about you? I mean, is that the setting of Friday the 13th? It's pretty typical camp next to a lake. You have some experiences with
but it's commonality.
Right.
So that's the thing.
Right. Yeah.
And I mean, I think if it would have been over the top early, then it wouldn't have had that. It wouldn't have resounded with the audience because, like you said, it's a bunch of kids.
Yeah.
Telling each other about the movie. Some of them that got to see it, some didn't. And so I got mileage out of that film. At summer camps, there was a camp. I went to Camp Cleowax in the Pacific Northwest for every summer. And I can't tell you how many times I would tell, full of BS, tell my cabin mates, that this was the camp that story was based on.
This is it.
Oh my goodness. And so nobody would go out of the cabin at night. It was so fantastic.
So you mentioned so we have this setting. We all have experienced a setting like that. It's an accessible film in that sense. And it's scary, I think, for that in that way, because it can happen to you. You mentioned earlier though that screens weren't in your home, right? So how was this? I guess a bigger question is how was horror treated in your home?
Great question.
But really just how was this? Because you went over to a friend's and watched it. I'm guessing mom and dad didn't know.
100%. And the thing is I think that the neighbors, dad especially, is my best friend. Growing up, we grew up next door to each other, and the dad was kind of like, this poor kid doesn't get any culture whatsoever, and he just kind of he just kind of let us go. But yeah, my household, oh my goodness, everything was forbidden.
Yeah.
And movies doubly so. You know, it was, especially like you talked about earlier, anything that had sexual content, anything that was over the top violence was just like, but of course, the fundamentalist group, you know, had to cash in on it too and built this thing called Distant Thunder. Do you remember this?
Yes, I do. Thief in the Night as well.
All of those. And so here we have them saying this is horrible, but they do the same thing, leveraging that whole mythos.
Yeah.
And, crazy. But small town Oregon, 700 people in the town I grew up in. So the Satanic Panic came late.
Oh, it did?
Yeah. So, I mean, the 70s, you know, it starts, but it really picked up steam early 80s. And so when these movies were coming out with Halloween, with, you know, Leatherface was equivalent to Satan when you're talking about that kind of stuff. The Omen especially, and The Exorcist is another big one. No rock and roll, no violence in film, no excess. This was all, so it was like, I was hiding my heavy metal music on the bottom of the tape deck. I was watching these movies. I was reading Stephen King like there's no tomorrow.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, personally, my dad, you know, I lived on an Air Force base. Kids were coming and going. We were like, you know, engaging with culturally different types of kids all the time. Okay. And that was really great for me growing up. But, you know, my parents were Christians and my dad had these phases where he would take the TVs and put them in the closet and lock them up. And I, of course, as a kid, I didn't quite understand what was motivating this. Now I get it, right? It was this panic that was sort of just raging throughout kind of the evangelical Christian communities throughout the United States, or the conservative communities throughout the United States. And it affected us as well. And I remember being so bummed. Like the great result of that, those phases that my dad went through where he locked everything up, is I read comics, and that's when I started collecting comic books.
That's awesome.
And so I still have I had an outlet, but I remember locking things up because what was out there was so awful.
Well, I had this conversation with my middle daughter the other day, and we were talking about it because she saw it for the first time the other night because she heard I was coming to hang out with you. And her comment, this little social focus young lady, is she could see how it spoke to the culture of the time, and how it wasn't just the gore and it wasn't just the sex, it was the conversations that these movies potentially started opening. Not only when it came to social change, but also that whole spiritual thing. We're talking about, you know, super fundamentalist mentality was the norm.
It really was. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't uncommon. Like, I mean, like you ran into this it seemed like even me as a kid living on an Air Force base, I had a neighbor that no TVs.
Right.
I had another neighbor that was like, there was a Mormon family that actually got really caught up in the panic.
Yeah.
And so it was like all around me all the time, and the conversations, and like, hey, so-and-so's showing Friday the 13th. Like, let's go.
Exactly
you
same.
know? And it was all these attempts to see these films. But what's interesting is there was even a movement, even among film criticism, like film critics that were saying, no. This is pure evil.
Lowbrow, too. Yeah. It wasn't just evil. It was like, you're making us all dumber by what you're creating.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think today when we look back on it, there is one element where you look at a Friday the 13th movie, and we're looking at 1 and 2, where you're like, yeah, it's stupid.
Can't be fun.
It's you know, it's silly, goofy. There's no depth. But you can look at how it's almost reflecting fears in the culture, and how there's more going on than just Jason's mom or Jason running around killing kids. And there's a lot happening, and it's a cultural artifact that's worth considering, I think.
I agree. I think that, and I mean, we can talk about this in depth when we get to a point where we're talking about it, but I think that the idea of generational trauma is just, that's a huge theme that comes through, and that spoke to a lot of these people coming out of the 60s into the 70s and now into this, yuppie 80s kind of set,
Right. Yeah, totally. And there's a pretty, and I teach film and for high school students. I have a 2-year film program. I teach juniors and seniors, and I'm constantly reading film criticism, film analysis. I'm looking at it. There's a pretty popular book that came out early 90s, I think, and it's called Men, Women, and Chainsaws. And the author, her name is Carol Clover, and she writes, there's a quote that really jumped out at me when I was reading it, just about films like Friday the 13th, the slasher film genre. And she writes the following, and I think it can expand a conversation about Friday the 13th in interesting ways, but she writes, the slasher film, not despite, but exactly because of its crudity and compulsive repetitiveness, gives us a clearer picture of current sexual attitudes, at least among the segment of the population that forms its erstwhile audience, than do the legitimate products of better studios.
It's true, because when you look at it, when I read that quote, it made me go, this is a social mirror, is what she's saying.
Yes.
These films are a social mirror. And what it's reflecting a lot is, and challenging, is that what's the sexual norms and attitudes.
Right.
That's a huge part of these films.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Like when we think about this quote, maybe we should just dive into the movie, because I think as we start talking about the movie, we can talk about the quote together. I think that might be helpful. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about Friday the 13th Part 1. All right, we're back. So I have in my mind a basic structure of how these films work. Correct me, edit, omit, whatever you want to do, Jeff. But in my mind, here's the basic structure.
All right.
Number 1, the killer, or Jason, kills someone in the first 10 minutes. Typically, the people involved are not quite connected to, in the Friday the 13th case, camp counselors or main cast members that are the focus of the film. So normally that happens right away. We see in Part 1, we have the hitchhiker that's on her way to the camp. And
I was going to say
she
that.
Gets it.
Yeah, in the Jeep.
Yeah, in the Jeep. And then before that, you have the camp in the 1950s and the 2 counselors getting killed because they're having sex.
Well, and the thing that is interesting in this is we get bludgeoned with foreshadowing. This isn't like light-handed foreshadowing.
It's not subtle.
Dude in the tow truck going, you're all going to die.
Yes,
you're like, oh, wait a minute, something bad might happen.
So normally these movies start off with something like that. Second, main cast shows up to the main location of the film. Yep. In this case, it's Camp Crystal Lake. Some people call it Camp Blood in the later films. So you have the main cast shows up. They introduce them. Normally it's silly. There's hijinks, all that stuff. And that's really number 3. It's these hijinks start to ensue. It sort of reveals to us who these characters are, what they're like. They might have just a one-note thing. This is the prankster.
Right.
This is the kid that likes to do makeup effects, like Part 4.
This is the nerd.
Yeah, this is the nerd, right? This is the cool, handsome athlete. And they go through all that. And they show it through typically like a practical joke or like some sort of silly situation or just like ridiculous dialogue. You go from that to there's some near misses, and the near misses could be a scare where you think someone's going to die and they don't. Like, so that could happen. Or there is a kill, but it's concealed for a later reveal. Yeah. So normally that happens and kind of keeps us involved in the movie, even though these movies are like an hour and 20 minutes. So after that, night comes and there's drinking, games, sex, typically. Some drinking, smoking pot, like that shows up as well. All the time. So that happens, which is a green light for Jason or Mrs. Voorhees. Miss Voorhees? We don't know where Dad is. Yeah. So Mrs. Voorhees to start her killing or Jason to his killing. Cast gets whittled down. This is number 7 to a final girl or maybe the girl and their love interest. Yep. So it could be girl and guy. And then final guy gets removed. They're either killed or knocked out. They might disappear. That happens in Part 2. It's really, really weird. It doesn't happen in Part 4. It's a little bit of different formula. And Part 6, a little bit different formula, but similar. kids in the movies tend to survive, like younger kids. Final girl, the ninth thing, final girl stops Jason or mom, and they escape, survive the film. All right. What would you add, omit, take away?
The only thing that I was thinking about with this was, especially in the first one, the idea that the first kill, and it's kind of interesting with the reveal at the end, is the camp cook.
Yes.
That's her job.
Yes.
So the first one to go is the analog or the mirror to who the killer actually is.
Yes.
Which is that was one thing that I thought was, that's interesting.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Especially as I'm older, I didn't really register as a kid. But
it doesn't register. It didn't for me for a long time. Yeah. That's good. Yeah. Anything else you would add, omit?
Let me see. I think that I just think that you killed it. Other than the bludgeoning, the foreshadowing bludgeoning, I think it was pretty much perfect. And that kind of is generally slasher films. Right?
It is, isn't it? It's so interesting. And I love when I watch a slasher film and it just plays with the structure. And it's like, oh no, we're going to move this here, this here, make this person this. Like whenever that happens, because I've seen so many of these films that follow this structure, if you play with the structure, I get very excited. I'm like, I love this. This is interesting.
That's why these third wave franchises, like second wave too, I think that one that really did a good job with that was Final Destination. Have you seen that series?
Yeah.
They really played with the structure.
Yes,
and so does Saw.
Yeah.
So we have these ones that have been birthed out of this first wave that have taken what's good and then even made it better.
They really scramble it, make it better, mix things around. Yeah, it's interesting. All right. Friday the 13th, one of the appeals to me is that I wish I could show it to my students because it's like I actually have an assignment in my head and I'm going to have to pick another movie to do this with, like something a little more appropriate.
Yeah.
But there are so many like just bad filmmaking choices in part one. And he's the crew, the cast and crew are not dumb. Like director went to Stanford. Like he's a bright guy. Like, and so, but basic film language isn't existing in part one. Like there's just like, they just set the camera, things happen. Part two, there's some clever moments. There's a moment where Jason, the dog gets lost and Jason's standing over the dog, and then there's a match cut to a hot dog on the grill.
I noticed that every time.
Yes, and it's like, oh, that's so clever. Part one doesn't really have any of that. It's just put the camera, kids walk around. There's some interesting things going on, but in terms of just like creativity with your camera, it doesn't happen.
New scene.
So the assignment that I would love to give my students is like take a scene and then have them reshoot it in a clever way, like, you know, and I don't think I can get away with that, but I'm on to something, I think. So, you know, we talked about the setting earlier. It's in New Jersey. There's a definite shift in the Friday the 13th movies where 1 and 2 were filmed in New Jersey, and I think 3 is filmed in California.
It is.
And it feels different. I don't mind those movies but there's something about the New Jersey that it felt a little more real to me. The others feel like there's sets, and I know like 6 is in Georgia, 7 was filmed in Alabama, my home state, which they're a little bit better, but those California ones, there's something, because I think they filmed some of it on the lot. Oh. And so there is this artificial feeling that I get in 3, especially with the barn and all that. But 1 and 2, I like 1 and 2's setting a lot.
And I think that you're onto something here, because the thing but again, okay, I've got 2 takes on this. The first take that I have on this is when my mom used to make spaghetti when I was a kid. Yeah. She's not a cook. Love my mama. Yeah. Mom, I love you. Love my mama. Yeah. But it was basically noodles and ketchup.
Right.
But that's all I knew.
Yeah.
And so when I tried actually good spaghetti, I was like, hey, this doesn't taste like spaghetti.
What's wrong?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it too, because for me, the birth of the love was this one. And there's something authentic about that rawness that you see in that.
Yeah.
And so you kind of are like, and the settings as well. You have that camp feeling. Everybody's experienced it. Right. So I don't only think it was the cinematography or the directing. I think it may have been, it was just a departure from what the norm was for the first two, maybe for me anyways.
Yeah, no,
that's what I would say.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's part one is so interesting. It's an anomaly, and for those of you that are listening and you're like, wait, how Friday the 13th? There's so many of them. The first one, there's really no Jason until the last seconds of the film,
right?
And I don't think he's mentioned by name until an hour in. Like a kid being drowned is sort of mentioned,
right?
But I don't think the name Jason isn't said till about an hour into the film. So he's pretty non-existent. And what makes part one so fascinating is the reveal of Betsy Palmer as Mrs. Voorhees, the killer. And I think a lot of people, when they think of part one, they hang their hat on that, on Betsy Palmer. And I've wavered over my life as I think way too much about the Friday the 13th series. There have been times where I'm like, it's not that good of a movie. But then there are other times where I'm like, Betsy Palmer's crazy in this movie. I mean, she does some things as an actress that I'm like, that's so good. And I'm like, I really enjoy it.
Kill him, mommy.
Yeah,
you're just like, wait, what? And she's talking. Oh, so good. But I would say, again, it's a fantastic reveal. That whole thing is awesome. Yeah. She did an amazing job. But I think it's only kind of its time. And that's why we're here.
Right.
We're talking about these firsts. And I think that it's been done over and over again.
Yes.
And so if it were to be produced tomorrow, it would fall flat.
Yeah.
But because it was a gateway thing, despite the tropiness and despite the campiness, what's the quote, to the newly initiated, all things are new.
Yeah.
And so it was just like, the beauty of, it's not this big burly man that
you would expect.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Because those are all the stories that we told.
That's it.
The guy with the hook hand and or the peg leg that you did, all those crazy things. That, anyways,
it's a great point, because culturally today we're a little more open to a mom killing everybody.
Yeah.
But in this time period, it feels like a 70s film, even though it came out in 80. It has these 70s sensibilities. The MPAA doesn't go crazy yet, and so the kills in part one, probably the most famous is Kevin Bacon getting the arrow through his neck in bed after he's had sex, and it's like such a great kill, and the makeup effects are truly they're top tier. I mean, they're really, really amazing stuff. And so, I'm losing my thought, but basically the idea is it's this product of the 70s before the MPAA starts cutting a lot of these films. So there's this, I can't believe I'm about to say this word, Jeff.
Say it.
There's almost this purity to part one because it's not being messed with as much as some of the other films.
You're right, though.
And I like it for that reason.
And we even see that into two.
Yeah, you do. You do.
Speaking of that Kevin Bacon scene, I love the analog in part two.
Yeah.
Where he has the spear and it's the same kind of thing.
Yes.
Same commentary.
Yeah. Absolutely.
You're having sex outside of marriage. You're
dead. You're got her. It's a given. And it's funny. John Carpenter was asked about that. People have criticized Halloween. Hey, are you making some kind of comment on the lack of this, of this pure, we're not pure anymore as a culture. And his comment was just bad things happen to everybody. Good people, bad things just happen. I don't know, man.
That's hard for me to grasp.
I know.
I'm a student of people, and so when I look at Halloween, it's all about suburban morality.
Right.
Whether he's trying to make a comment or not, he's battling this in or whatever. And sexual politics is big in Halloween. I think that is Friday the 13th is so Freudian.
It is, isn't it?
I mean, that maternal love
Yes.
thing. Oh my goodness. And sexual freedom. It even goes into, if you really think about it, the idea of capitalism and the violence of capitalism. All of these things are just laid out. And you can say, no, I just made a scary film.
Yeah.
But you're a product of your environment,
culture.
your culture, the whole thing. And so there's some stuff there's some stuff underpinning it that is shouting to be set free.
Part 1 and part 2 they feel different, not just because of setting, location, but just they're given a little more. The MPAA does really start to crack down on part 2 because there's a quote where they felt like they got the wool pulled over their eyes with part 1, so they got a little bit more involved in part 2. And there was like, we haven't gotten to part 2 yet, but of course, you mentioned the spear in the bed. They're having sex, spear through the back. There was actually a Italian horror film that had that kill in it. That showed the spear going through the body. They filmed the same thing. Greg Nicotero, who did Walking Dead, is so famous for Walking Dead. He, of course, is buddies with all these makeup effects. He did not work on part 2, but he knew him, and they were like, hey, do you want to see what we did for part 2? And he's like, yeah. And Nicotero in an interview was like, I still remember seeing the footage. The kill was so graphic and disturbing and great. It was so well done, and they edited it. So they're getting involved. I mean, you still have the guy in the wheelchair getting the, I mean, what is going, like, people were freaking out over that.
Equal opportunity kills.
Jason doesn't discriminate.
He doesn't at all.
Oh my gosh. So, there's so much to talk about. Back to part 1.
Okay.
Betsy Palmer, I just want to say this for our audience's sake, because I think they'll get a kick out of it. Palmer was on her way home. She was doing stage work and driving home from New York City, I think to her home in Connecticut. She ended up, car broke down, had a nice car, Mercedes. It's done. It's kaput. She loses the car, and her daughter was like, what about this car here? It's about 10 grand. Around the same time, she gets an offer for Friday the 13th for 10 grand. She did the film. She thought this script is terrible. This is garbage. She later, of course, embraced her character and just the fandom. But she was doing this to like 10 days of work, a former Boy Scout camp in New Jersey, 10 grand. I can buy a new car. And that's how we got Betsy Palmer. I haven't mentioned Tom Savini, who did the makeup effects. His name's been dropping on my mind this whole episode, but he does this part 1, and then he comes back for part 4 because it's called the final chapter. He thinks it's the last one. Right. He's like, I want to go out on the last one. Of course, that doesn't happen. But he truly is gifted, and he made a movie called Maniac. It's one of the most disturbing slasher films I've ever seen. Prowler, he worked on Prowler. He's done a lot of stuff, but so gifted and talented at makeup effects. And Corey Feldman's character in part 4 is loosely based on him.
Like an homage to him. That's lovely.
Because he's always doing makeup effects. Part 1, there's a moment where one of the characters is dropped off, and the police car drops him off and drives away, and where the camera's set, it's just like you could have done 50 different things with this shot, and it's like they put it on a tripod and they were like, okay, get out of the car or walk off screen. And I'm just like, but there are things that we can like about part 1. And I know my film nerd is getting the best of me, but for you, Jeff, as we kind of close out our discussion on part 1 and start talking a little bit more about part 2, what are for you some of the things that you've I don't know if I should say fondly when talking about part 1, but what?
Yes, definitely. Please.
That you enjoyed, that you're like, I liked this about part 1.
Well, I mean, we've talked about it, the simplicity and the purity. And I'm going to say it. We're going now forever. It's going to be one of the most pure. It's not the most pure. Because I'd say some of the earlier work was the standalones were even better. But I think of it as at the macro level. Yeah. And I think that this was the forbidden fruit, and they did a great job. So did Halloween. So did all of those early franchises of jumping in and saying, "You're not the status quo if you watch this." And I think that we were talking about this earlier. I don't know if you want to go there with Siskel and Ebert.
Yeah, let's go there.
Okay. So the idea that Siskel would jump in and just rip it. I mean, he even gave away the ending in his review, trying to kill it.
Yeah.
Made it more metal. It just made it better. So he ruins the ending, made me want to see it more. Listen to what he said about Sean Cunningham. He said, Cunningham is the most despicable creature to ever infest the movie business.
Oh, wow.
He needs to have a jacket with that on the back.
Oh,
that made him the most metal guy in my thinking. Because remember, Siskel and Ebert were the gateway for all things movies. So when you would read this or you would watch them on TV, if they hated it and this was counterculture, you were like, He compares it to Halloween because it was right there. But he says, trying to push us away from it, he says it's more bloody and more explicit. Yeah. Guess what that did to a little kid?
Yeah, it's like, when can I see this movie?
I'll take 2.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. May I have another? It's just like, yes. So I think on the macro level, I think that's what they were really tapping into for me. That's where it went right.
Yeah.
And again, was it happenstance or was it government plot? I don't know, but whatever it was just a perfect storm for me.
Yeah, it's wild when you look at the 80s box office. I mean, it did $40 million, something like that. I mean, it was ridiculous numbers in that time period. It was in the top 20 box office films. It was a huge hit. People were going to see this movie. And so the critical response, I went back and tried to look at all like the primary source critical reviews, and I don't think anyone liked it.
No one did.
Like, no one liked this.
But when we're talking about slasher films, that is not outside of what is just typical. They always got bad reviews, and I think
they wanted to get a bad review, right?
I'm telling you, because again, we're talking about people wanting to step away from this very fundamentalist.
Yes.
Like you said, Pentecostal evangelical really holds sway. This is like we're talking Reagan era and all this kind of stuff, and we're looking at it and we're going, I don't want to just say no.
Yeah.
I want to say yes.
Yeah.
So
here we go. Yeah, so you get to part 2, which, let me see if I can remember. Part 2 went into production 4 months after 1 was released.
Really? I believe you, because it came out really quick.
Yeah, so you're talking part 1 is 80, part 2 is 81. Yeah. And so they rush it and they start working on it. And I mean, oddly, you have at the end of part 1, you have, the Betsy Palmer showdown, where she gets decapitated.
Yeah.
What? One
of the best scenes.
Part 2 is like, makes no sense, but that's okay. It's like, apparently Jason witnessed the murder of the mom, his mom. And for some people, that makes Jason really sympathetic.
It does.
And it's like, these counselors killed my mother. And so he witnessed it. The timeline is so whacked out. Like, I don't even understand the timeline. But anyways, he witnessed it. And in part 2, he shows up and he starts off with killing the final girl from part 1. And it's hysterical because they were running into a problem with their runtime. They didn't have enough to make it like a true feature. Like, they were like right on the edge. Like, okay, we need to start padding this movie where we can. And so Adrienne King, who was the actress that played Final Girl from part 1, she is at the beginning of part 2, and she's just walking around her apartment. She looks in the fridge. She talks to her mom on the phone. All that's ad-libbed. That's not scripted anywhere. She's ad-libbing the whole thing. She didn't even know when she showed up to set that her character was going to die.
Oh, that's awesome.
And so if you remember, and some of you I'm sure remember, and then some of you are like, Friday the 13th, what? Part 2, at the beginning when Adrienne King's character gets killed, it's a screwdriver to the head after she opens the refrigerator and finds, I think it's
mom's head
in the refrigerator, right?
Mom's head in the fridge.
Like, look what you did. You're gone. And poor Adrienne King, several things. I want to mention these 2 things. One, the retractable screwdriver that's to go into her temple malfunctioned, and it pierced into her head. It hurt her badly. So there was an accident on set, hurt her pretty bad. That was one. The second thing is when she finished part 1. So remember, these are just a few months apart.
Right.
She wanted more money. They couldn't cast her, like, of course. But she had, she said in an interview, like, she had a stalker, and it was really dangerous. Yeah. And she did not grace the circuit for these like conventions for Friday the 13th until, I want to say, at minimum 10 years, but I think 20 years sounds more right, where she started showing up to these conventions.
Understandably.
Yeah, she was really traumatized by the event. She didn't go into a lot of details in the interview of what happened, but it was criminal, she said. She goes, at that time, sadly, it wasn't this idea of stalkers.
Right.
You know, you have Hinckley, you know, wanting to like impress Jodie Foster. But like, you don't have like some of the things that you like it's not part of the cultural conversation of this idea of stalkers. Right.
Right.
So Hinckley, right? Was that the guy's name? Yeah. So, part 2 comes out. You start with that. What do you like when you compare 1 and 2? Do you separate them or you combine them? Because it feels when I did the rewatch, it felt like just one big story.
And that's what it is. So you definitely, I guess the one thing that we haven't touched on that was interesting to me, every year we rewatch it at my house. Generally, when I say we, everybody else goes to bed and I watch them.
yes, that's how it is in my house. Except my son. My son tries to sneak it. So.
Well, and see, my middle daughter, as she's gotten older, has gotten into some more of the highbrow and stuff with like Hereditary and Midsommar and that kind of stuff. But the thing that I noticed every year I watch them, they feel like they're getting slower and slower.
Yes.
And that's not just the second one where you knew they were dragging their feet, and especially that I'm having a fever dream beginning, and you're like, just get it over with. But in the first one also, there's people jogging, and what we would see in today's film is they're jogging, and suddenly they're attacked and dead, and then it's a cut scene to something new.
It moves.
And these, it drags it out, but that's the beauty of it.
It's
because
different.
It builds suspense, and it builds that and anxiety, if you will. Oh, I love it. I think that's part of it, and it's similar in both films. So it does feel like, with them being filmed so closely together, there hasn't been that time for the change in how the cinematography and how the time pacing and timing is. So it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, there's a lot going on. Like, if we take a macro view of film, there's a lot going on. Like, one is that our modern sensibilities when we watch these early Friday the 13th films, we're like, get on with it. Come on. Right? Faster. We want quicker cuts. You know, in Mad Max Fury Road, George Miller and his editor, they decided to cut every 2 seconds. And this film came out in 2015. So there's a cut every 2 seconds in that film. It's insane. It's insanity. I mean, obviously there's some dialogue, conversations longer. Any action scene is 2 seconds cut, 2 seconds cut, 2 seconds cut. And you can almost time it out with a stopwatch.
Feels like a migraine.
It's insane, right? But this is our TikTok social media world we live in. Right. We want things fast. So Friday the 13th feels like this anomaly if you're just ingesting current pop culture, right? Like modern pop culture, and then you go back and watch it, you're like, what is going on? Right. It's disorienting in some ways, but that doesn't mean it's bad. And I agree with you. I think it does build suspense, and I think and sometimes it's just completely ridiculous, but that's the fun of these movies. It's like you just at the beginning of part 2, she's walking around an apartment. She has the dream. She talks on the phone. She gets a scare. She's in the shower at one point, and you think it's a psycho kill like moment where she opens the shower curtain. Is Jason there? No, it's not. Right. And I love that play with the audience at the beginning of 2.
Well, and the levitating cat meme has never gone away, right? That cat doesn't just jump through the window. That cat is like 10 feet off the ground flying through that window. Yeah, my skin I was out of it. It was such a good moment.
Two, though, when you start looking at the direction, there's this cinematic language that starts. And there are some films... 3 doesn't really do it. 4 is interesting. 6 is just delightful if you like just filmmaking and camera angles and shot types and camera movement and all that. I mean, it's just there's so much going on in 6. It's like, this feels like a movie. Right. Like, not just a Friday the 13th movie. 2, though, does some really interesting things. And I really like like it compared to one. I mean, I enjoy one, but I really like two. And of course, it's my first. Like, it's the first one I saw. Yeah. And so I have this fondness for it. There's a few things I want to point out that I want to hear what you think just about what you liked about part two. One, I know the hockey mask is a big deal for Jason. I don't mind the bag with the hole for an eye it's very disturbing to me. Yeah. And it touches maybe my Southern sensibilities of like the Klan and like
I never even thought of that.
There's some weird Southern Jeremy stuff going on when I watch it where I'm like, oh wow, this is disturbing. So there's that kind of feel to it. There's this, I think, and it happens with a hockey mask. But with the bag over the head, it's like I'm imagining what he looks like. And of course, we get the reveal at the end, but I'm imagining how deformed he is and what he looks like as a grown up. And when I was a kid, it really terrified me.
Oh, interesting.
So I liked that. And I know some people don't. They don't like it at all. But I'm really like, I'm okay with the sack over his head, and just the one eye hole. And there's a few moments where I guess they did some type of dolly shot. You don't really see the tracks in it. But it's when Jason is chasing the final girl of two, right. And it's like the camera's moving backwards and Jason is running, and it's like a really cool shot, and it just stands out to me. It's like terrifying as he's hunting her. And there's that cat and mouse in two that I love. There's a cat and mouse in all of them, yeah. But I love two where she's hiding behind the car, he comes around, and like you see him in the background and she's in the foreground. Just the position of the camera. There's just some things that I just enjoy about two. I found the cast way more charismatic for me.
They were very two-dimensional in that first one. But again, that's also what made it what it is.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it was evolving.
Yeah, it was.
So we see this next step. And I'm sure budgetary reasons were the... Yeah. And as you said, as you get into the later iterations, all of a sudden there's actually... filmography. It's happening. Yeah. But I think that looking at two, we start to really see some of those consistent horror film, slasher film specific scenes. And I think that you're right. That track, that girl running through the woods. How many times have we seen that in how many different films, different iterations again? Right. It's always that, or that cat jumping through the window, or all of those things.
Right.
This was the birthplace. This was the pool in which they emerged. Loved it.
Yeah, Amy Steele plays Jenny, who's the final girl, and two has a lot of weird things going on. They all go to a bar at one point, and some of the cast just stays there, and so they escape death. Like apparently. They're never mentioned again. They never come back. That's just strange to me. But Jenny's really interesting. I believe early in the film she mentioned she's a psychology student, plays a role. I know when I talk to like hardcore, like they're out there, hardcore Friday the 13th fans, Jenny is like one of the most popular final girls, if not the most popular. And it's because of a couple things. One, there's this intelligence, this fierce intelligence to her. Two, she puts on... the sweater at the end and fools Jason. Kneel down, Jason. And of course, Jason like sees his mom's head severed behind. Like, so she doesn't completely fool Jason, but it's like she's not. And she comes at him with a chainsaw at one point. Yep. Like, there's like some really cool stuff going on, and it's like, yes, like,
but again,
go Jenny.
It's that second wave feminism that you see in Nightmare on Elm Street too, where it has a really strong female character in that first one, and then it bleeds on into it. You're starting to see this girl power thing lived out again. I know it's just a film is just a slasher film, but we're seeing these undertones of what's happening in culture.
It's interesting. I've heard some people say, guys would drag their girlfriends to see Friday the 13th. I distinctly remember girls wanting to go see it. Like in groups of girls, not with any boys around. It's just like, let's go see it. And so, of course, guys wanted to see it. You know why? But like, girls were going too, and it was interesting for that reason that it was for everybody. But like everyone seemed to be of the youth culture. We were like, I'm gonna go see this.
And that's the point. It wasn't everyone. Yeah. It was those
Yes.
kids my age at that point through your mid-20s, that was their wheelhouse.
Right. Yeah. No, you're right. And it's interesting. Just two, I think, I need to be careful here because it's Friday the 13th. I don't want to make these grand statements. But two, I really believe it didn't make the money that one did, but I really feel like two kind of sets the stage. Almost like, yeah, Jason can be the villain and we can keep having Jason coming back.
Yeah.
Like, I think he works as this villain for the films.
And I think the utility of Jason is different than the utility of like a Michael Myers who is just evil incarnate.
Yeah.
You know, because Jason, like you said, there was some sympathy from the audience because if he saw Mama get her head chopped off, all of a sudden, and I mean, when you get down the road and he gets electrocuted and comes back to life, and we start to get into the mysticism of it and everything, it kind of takes a left turn. It
changes,
not in a bad way.
No,
I really appreciate it. But I think in those early ones, you're talking about, again, there's just something where you're like, okay, what he's doing is wrong and it's horrible and I would never do it, but I can live vicariously through him.
Yeah.
You know?
It's interesting, when I was in college, they did it was like Halloween, and they showed Friday the 13th. They showed like a double feature. I can't remember which ones they showed, but I have this memory. I was like a freshman in college. I have a memory of the crowd, the audience cheering for Jason. It's like, get him, Jason! Like Jason was oddly the hero of these stories. It was just crazy. But then how it would flip at the end, and then the same crowd cheering for Jason would just start going crazy for the final girl.
It's true.
It's just like, yeah, like they would just be applauding. It was just so much fun to see.
And it's the same crowd that cheered for the alligators in the old Tarzan movie. It's been going on forever. There's something about seeing the antagonist be able to live out what it is they've been created to do.
And oddly, and there's some deep psychological things going on with horror, right?
Yeah.
But it's a weird way that we as an audience can collectively face terrible things. And I don't want to like overstate it, or I don't want to misrepresent people, but my hunch is that some people have really tough times in their lives, and when they go see a horror film, it's this catharsis for them.
Yeah.
Like as they process through watching like a final girl get through this ordeal, right? And they attach to this character, and they're like, oh, they did it. Maybe I don't know if they're thinking specifically like maybe I can do it too, but like there's this disconnect from their tough life. They watch someone overcome really horrible odds, and they walk out of the theater going, that was scary, that was fun, and I oddly feel encouraged, which is crazy to think about, but I do believe there were some people that had that response to any horror movie, slasher movie at this time period. I think there were people that really enjoyed it for that reason.
Well, and I mean, it kind of depends on, like you were saying, I agree. Right. I think it depends on where you're at. Because I think that, I think of, what was his name? The young one in Children of the Corn, Job.
Yes.
Played, what's Robbie's last name?
I can't remember.
It's like Kiger, I think. Robbie Kiger. But anyways, here is this child caught up in this cult that he who walks behind the rose but escapes with at the end, and there's something about seeing that character, even though this wasn't the main protagonist, it was one of the more flat characters. That resounded with me as a kid going, oh, he made it out. And I know that resounded with me more because that had a lot of fundamentalist religion overtones.
And, that's a really good point.
And so I could say, oh, he got out.
Right.
And so I don't know. Not that there's necessarily has to be, like you said before, there doesn't have to be more to the horse than just being the horse.
Right.
But I think you're right. I think that there's a catharsis is a great way of putting it when you see that final. And then, of course, the next one comes in there right at the very beginning. But,
that's right.
But
that's right.
You got to the end. You got to the end.
You had like a year break before the next one.
In that case.
Gosh. All right, let's take a break. When we come back, we will be talking about There Can Be Only One.
There can be only one.
All right. What is the single best thing about Friday the 13th, part 1 and 2? It can be a scene, a theme, a character, a single shot. It could be the music. We haven't even talked about the music.
Oh, yeah.
For you, what's the best thing for you about part 1 and 2?
There is just no way you can step away from what is the most analog between the two, which is the endings.
Yes. We need to talk about that. Yeah.
But for different reasons for me. I don't know. You can tell me what you think. But when I was that young boy in the living room on that brown shag carpet, laying there freaking out in my sleeping bag, watching this thing, at the end when she's escaped, she's in the canoe waiting for the police to come, sunlight comes, she's dragging her hand in the water.
Yes.
And you're just thinking, she made it.
Music is for the first time like friendly.
Exactly. It's peaceful almost.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, this skinny, misshapen child beast jumps out of the water and rips her underneath. And again, this is, from my perspective at this point in life, I don't have the bandwidth to be prepared for this. So it's a complete shock. And so blows me away. That has to be for me, for one anyways, the best scene.
Yeah. Well, and 2, I love what you told me before we recorded. Just like the 2 scare at the end where he comes through the window. 1, that's an awesome stunt. But for you, did you say something like, I was expecting it and it still like got me?
That's the thing. So in the second one, now I've been initiated into this club of loving this. And I've seen a few other films before too. And so now this has become a thing. There's always going to be that life, death, and then resurrection at the end, right? And so I'm waiting for it. But it comes from the place you don't expect. You're expecting him bursting through the door. And the window behind without his bag on his face because she's pulled it off, and you get to see, because remember when she chops him in the neck with that machete and then pulls off the mask because she wants to see, we don't get to see it.
We don't. And
that was the foreshadowing that my brain didn't catch until later. All of a sudden he comes through and looking like the toxic Avenger and takes her away. So good.
It's great. I remember pausing, like someone had on videotape, and I remember pausing it to look at him.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, what do you look like?
We did too. Gross. I think everyone must have, because you're like, because it's not great.
Yeah. It's not. It's, 2, there's so much that I like 2 more than 1. I understand 1's place. Like, I know it's important. But for me, 2, when I think of There Can Be Only One, first, like Harry Manfredi, who does the music, I mean, he came up with Mama Kill, right? And he just did that. And there are times where the music is surprising. And if you're listening to this and you're like, you know what? But one of these awful movies in and watch it, like, pay attention to the music. I mean, he improves too. I mean, when he gets to 4, he does music for every film. When he gets to 4 and 5 and 6 is okay, but 4, his musical score for 4 is incredible. It's really good, and he employs things at the right time. It just it serves that movie so well. So 1, I would say, if I think of There Can Be Only One, when I think of the series, it's him. Manfredi is the composer. For me, though, I think when I think of There Can Be Only One, I'm going to have to say the final girl for part 2. Jenny is awesome. She really is someone I liked. I liked that she wasn't just intelligent, but that she fought, and she thought, she was brilliant, but she was tough and thought on her feet. She didn't crumble. Like she came through, and I really think she might be the best final girl in the series. And there's some great final girls in all of horror, but in the Friday the 13th film. So for me, when I think of There Can Be Only One, when I was a kid and a teenager, I really liked her. And it wasn't like lust-like when you're a stupid kid, but it was like, I really thought she was cool. And I was like, she's cool.
Well, and if you look at horror, that slasher films from that point, horror films in general, you start to see that really empowered, intelligent female character who is making booby traps for Freddy Krueger,
Yeah.
or all those kind of things in the dream realm, and I'm gonna catch him, you get him when we come out, and you start to see that be a consistent kind of character built into them, and say, so I like that a lot. I hadn't considered it that way. That's a cool thing.
Yeah. Oh man, I could go on. I can go on, and I know our audience wants us to go on, but we're gonna stop here on Friday the 13th, part 1 and 2. You can find us on patreon.com/living the past, LIVIN the past, and find out what we're doing there. You get early access to it. Like, for example, this episode will be out days before it's released to the public. So you can get early releases. You can get previews of the set that we're working on for our video work for YouTube. You can get all sorts of information and access. But not only that, you can help shape the show. And right now our patrons are voting on what they want us to cover on Halloween. So our last podcast of the month, they're voting right now on what we're going to do, what show we're going to do. So you can be a part of that if you go over to Patreon. We're on Facebook. It's a dumpster fire. I don't even use it. So it's there. Like, you can look at it and there's like posts from a year ago. But that's it. That's the only place. You can find us on YouTube as well. If you just type in Living in the Past podcast, you can find us on YouTube. Lots of stuff going on there. Our next episode is Alien. They'll be coming up soon after you listen to this wonderful episode here. Alien will be coming right behind it, and we're excited to dive into that. As always, hey, thank you so much for listening. We're so excited it's October and we can revisit these amazing horror films. And as always, we'll talk soon.